What if I told you that Hamilton's accident was not a simple disassemble, but the direct consequence of an internal betrayal in Ferrari? Stay, because what you are going to discover about Maranello's team will completely change your perception about its 2025. The Zandvoort circuit is a trap disguised as masterpiece. Its Pirelli curves, elevation changes, and unpredictable grip make it one of the most technical challenges in the calendar. But there is a section that always demands more than the rest: the Curve 3. This curve is Pirelli inclined inland as an American oval track, allowing speeds much higher than in a conventional curve. However, that same design can become hell when the conditions change, as happened in the Grand Prix of the 2025. The race was stable until the first drops began to fall. Light rain, not a flood, enough to alter adhesion in a circuit that was already dry. On Vuelta 23, Hamilton was in full persecution of George Russell for the 7th position. He went to the limit, looking for each tenth, demanding the car, asphalt, and himself. But then, when he reached Curve 3, he committed what seemed like a minimum error. His rear tires touched the outer white line. That line, painted on the asphalt, becomes an almost friction surface when moistened. It's like stepping ice. It is not something exclusive to Zandvoort, but in this circuit, and in that specific curve, the punishment is immediate. Hamilton's Ferrari SF25 lost traction suddenly. The rear of the car was uncontrolled and there was no room for correction. They hit the barriers with the front, destroying the wing and part of the chassis. Hamilton's career ended at that moment, and his radio words were brief but blunt: "I'm very sorry, guys." But behind that sorry, a storm was hidden. Because from Friday's free training, Hamilton had already been warning stability problems in that same curve. His car showed erratic behavior when braking and accelerating inside the Pirelli, something unusual for a pilot with his experience, and especially in a curve where traction should be high thanks to inclined design. What seemed like a simple human error was soon questioned. Telemetry data did not lie. Irregularities were noticed that could not be explained only by the rain. There was something else, and that something was about to be revealed in later days. Curve 3, in that context, was transformed from an accident stage to evidence of a deeper problem within Ferrari. And there begins the true story. Riccardo Adami, Lewis Hamilton's track engineer, is not exactly a media man. His role is to be in the shade, make precise technical decisions, and maintain impeccable communication with his pilot. In Ferrari, that figure has a huge weight because the margin of error is minimal and the consequences devastating. Therefore, what happened after the accident in Zandvoort not only surprised fans, but left a good part of the paddock in shock. Adami broke the code of silence. Just days after the Grand Prix, internal statements and documents began to leak. According to these leaks, Adami would have confirmed that between the end of Friday's day and the start of Saturday, Hamilton's car was modified without prior notice or his authorization. And this, in modern Formula One, is not only a violation of the operational protocol, it is a direct attack on trust between pilot, engineer, and team. The changes were not minor. The rear driving height was altered, a variable that directly impacts the center of gravity of the car and therefore in its behavior in rapid and braking curves. The preload of the differential was also adjusted, another critical parameter that regulates how the power between the rear wheels is distributed. That is, the central balance of the car was touched without any validation with the man who had to pilot him. The most worrying thing is not only that these changes occurred, but were implemented from Maranello by the Central Performance Group, a technical unit responsible for applying solutions based on predictive simulations and models. In other words, a car that was running under certain references developed between pilot and track engineer was intervened from the central headquarters. This reference data were eliminated, the car's setup was restarted, and Hamilton was launched to Saturday's classification with a car that he no longer knew. And while all this happened, Charles Leclerc's car did not suffer any modification. The Monegasco Pilot SF25 maintained exactly the specifications it had worked on Friday. This not only generated speculations about favoritisms within the team, but also aroused the suspicion of internal disorganization that goes beyond simple human error. Adami apparently tried to reverse the changes on Saturday morning, but the times were adjusted, and the technical team in Zandvoort did not have the ability to go back without completely disarming the car. In addition, he faced a hierarchical structure in which Maranello's decisions have priority even what the data on track dictates. This situation leaves an awkward question. Can an engineer continue working with full autonomy when his own criteria is replaced by algorithms designed thousands of kilometers from the circuit? And more importantly, how can a pilot trust a car whose behavior no longer responds to what he built with his engineer? This revelation was not just a technical anecdote. It was a statement of internal war. Ferrari exposed his own structural fractures, and with them, he lit an alarm that could define the rest of his season. The Hamilton accident was thoroughly analyzed, as usual in Ferrari and in any Formula One team. But on this occasion, the data not only served to understand a failure. They served to confirm a suspicion that had already begun to poison the environment since before the impact. The telemetry collected in SF25 number 44 offered a disturbing image. The car behavior patterns did not align with the parameters that Hamilton and his engineer had refined during Friday's free training. It was a different car. And worse, it was an unpredictable car. One of the first indicators were the spikes of revolutions under braking. In technical terms, this may be related to an asymmetric torque delivery, something that occurs when the differential is not adjusted correctly. In other words, the car did not distribute the power stable between the rear wheels to the decelerate. This generates sudden survival at the curve entrance, especially in low adhesion conditions such as those in Zandvoort during that moment of fine rain. The pilot in that scenario becomes a passenger, but it wasn't just that. The load sensors on the rear axle revealed that the driving height had been high millimeters with respect to the original configuration. It may seem a minor difference, but in the aerodynamics of a Formula One, that can mean the loss of critical curve support points. The airflow changes, the load on the diffuser is altered, and the car begins to float instead of adhering to the asphalt. Hamilton explained it in his reports as a feeling of rear loss without notice. And now we know why. The most serious problem was that this new configuration annulled all the previous references that the pilot had built during training. In F1, each pilot refines his style to the behavior of his car during the weekend. The feedback with its engineer, the fine adjustment in braking, turns, traction. All that is based on repeatable patterns. And when that pattern breaks without warning, there is no margin of adaptation, especially in a layout as technical as Zandvoort and in changing climatic conditions. Curve 3, which already requires a commitment between lateral load and vertical traction due to its parallel, becomes a critical area when suspension and differential values are not expected. The new configuration reduced the compression of the rear axle just at the time aerodynamic support was needed. That generated a subtle bounce, barely noticeable, which destabilized the car in the entrance transition to apex. The result was a slow, almost elegant, but irreversible sliding towards the wall. This type of error is not produced by chance. It is the direct consequence of disconnecting the pilot from his most valuable tool, the predictability of his car. The SF25 that Hamilton crashed was not the same one he had piloted on Friday. And that rupture, that technical divorce, was the real culprit of the accident. Neither the rain nor the white line. The real failure was structural, and now Ferrari must respond for it. What happened in Zandvoort cannot be filed as a simple anecdote or an unfortunate chapter in Ferrari's trajectory. It is, in full rule, a turning point. Because beyond the accident, what was exposed in that weekend was a structural conflict that goes beyond the track. The disconnection between the data and the human experience, between the algorithms and the instinct, between the Maranello Central and the men who really live the return circuit. The Central Performance Group, an entity created to provide stability and efficiency to the technical decision-making process, ended up becoming an invasive entity. One that, under the promise of optimization by simulations, broke the delicate balance of trust that a team needs to pay to the highest level. This type of remote intervention without operational support on the track is not only a threat to performance, but also raises a philosophical dilemma on how a Formula One equipment should operate in the era of hyperconnectivity. To what extent can critical decisions be made by engineers who are not seeing live what the pilot feels? Where is the line between technological assistance and absolute control that disconnects the main actors, pilot and track engineer? The Hamilton accident was not the product of a treacherous curve or an inopportune rain. It was the direct result of a structure that prioritized the theory on practice, the projection on real sensation, the algorithm on the ear of the engineer who listens to the minimum changes in the pilot's voice when something is not going well. That is Zandvoort's toughest lesson. When Ferrari stopped listening to his own protagonists, he lost more than a race. He lost a part of his identity as a racing team. Now the challenge is not just a technician. It is cultural. If Ferrari really wants to fight for titles in 2025 and beyond, he needs to redefine its power structure. It is not enough to have one of the best pilots in history at the wheel. It is not enough to have the most advanced simulation. What makes a champion team is not the sum of loose pieces, but cohesion among all of them. Maranello must decide whether you will continue to trust your automatic systems blindly or if you will restore the value of the track experience, technical intuition, the connection between those inside the box.